everyone, and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Scottish Government Handling of Harassment Complaints Committee. We will move straight on to our evidence session today on phase 1 of the inquiry, which is on the development of the handling of harassment complaints procedure. I won't repeat my statement from the start of last week's meeting, but I refer members, witnesses and media to its terms. In summary, we are bound by the terms of our remit and the relevant court orders, including the need to avoid contempt of court by identifying certain individuals, including through jigsaw identification. The committee as a whole has agreed that it is not our role to revisit events that were a focus of the trial that could be seen to constitute a rerun of the criminal trial. Our remit is quite clear. It states, to consider and report on the actions of the First Minister, Scottish Government officials and special advisers in dealing with complaints about Alex Salmond, former First Minister, considered under the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers, and procedure and actions in relation to the Scottish Ministerial Code. The more we get into specifics of evidence, the more we run the risk of jigsaw identification. As previously explained, I'd be grateful if members' questions and witnesses' answers could reflect these terms, and in return I'll endeavour to let the evidence sessions flow within our legal limits. Wherever possible, please also avoid naming specific government officials unless they were central to the development of the policy. Lastly, for ease of navigation, where possible, please refer to the document reference number and footnote reference if asking on a particular record submitted by the Government. With that, may I welcome James Hind, Head of Cabinet, Parliament and Governance Division of the Scottish Government. And can I begin by inviting Mr Hind to take the oath?
Yes.
If you would raise your right hand, please, Mr Hind. And then repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth, the whole
that I will
truth,
tell
and
the
nothing
truth,
but the truth.
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And may I invite you, Mr Hind, to make a very brief opening statement to explain your role in the Scottish Government and the development of the policy.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, committee members. So I will make some very brief opening remarks just to explain my role within government and in relation to the development of the procedure. I began my present role in early 2013 and have a wide range of responsibilities within government, but the ones most relevant to today, I think, are my role as head of the Cabinet Secretariat and also my role in giving advice on matters relating to the Scottish Ministerial Code. My involvement with what was to become the procedure began following the First Minister's Commission in October 2017 that the government should review its policies and procedures to ensure they were fit for purpose and gave confidence to those who might raise concerns. Given my role in relation to the Ministerial Code, it fell to me to lead the process that led in due course to the creation of the procedure. Drawing upon legal and HR advice, we had a number of underpinning objectives. The procedure had to be lawful, it had to reflect best HR practice, it had to be fair and balance the interests of all parties involved, and it had to respect the responsibilities of the Permanent Secretary and the First Minister. Throughout the drafting process, we tested the procedure against each of those criteria. The procedure was approved by the Permanent Secretary, given her duty of care for the staff of the Scottish Government, and by the First Minister as the arbiter of ministerial standards of behaviour. Convener, in answering questions, I will draw upon the report that the Scottish Government has provided to the committee, as well as to the supporting documentation and the chronology of events that we also supplied. For the avoidance of doubt, Convener, I'm giving evidence to the committee on behalf of ministers and not in a personal capacity today. And finally, Convener, I note that at the request of the committee, the PCS Union has submitted written evidence. In the interest of full disclosure, I declare I'm a member of that union. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Hind, and I'll move first to our Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell.
Good morning, Mr Hind. I wonder, prior to taking up your position, your present position in early 2013, I think you said, would you confirm if you've been employed in any other role or capacity which may be relevant to the committee's inquiry from 2008 to the present day?
Immediately prior to this role, I held a role within the corporate centre of the organisation and had responsibility for, amongst many other things, buildings and estates of the Scottish Government. That meant I was responsible for a time for the functioning of Bute House, as well as many other buildings the Scottish Government has around the country, and I would occasionally have contact with the former First Minister in that role.
So would it be your position that you don't have any experience or anything that might be relevant from these former roles to our inquiry?
In terms of the procedure, no, there was nothing relevant to the procedure in terms of the matters that the committee is considering.
Okay. I wondered, there's a partnership agreement between the CSGU, the Council of Scottish Government Unions, and the Scottish Government. Have you had any direct involvement in issues that that partnership looks at, and particularly employee relations?
Have we moved on to my current role, Ms.
Yes,
Mitchell?
absolutely.
My current role? No, I've got no involvement. I don't have any direct involvement with the CSGU in this role.
And in your current position, are you aware of any employment relations specifically regarding bullying or sexual harassment which surfaced, which were reported or talked about anecdotally, informally, or were the subject of a formal complaint?
Certainly nothing relating to a formal complaint other than the material that has emerged subsequently. Anecdotally, I don't feel, that I'm in a position really to make any comments about what may be hearsay or anecdote about these matters.
Well, anecdotally, I suppose I'm meaning in a phone call, in a text, any other form of communication.
No, nothing like that.
So
no.
quite clear, from 2013 up to the present, you were aware of nothing that would cause you concern in terms of informal or formal complaints about bullying or sexual harassment?
No, I'm kind of racking my mind to think if there was anything. It's a very long period, and there was nothing I can identify that I'd be able to say to the committee I was personally involved in, or I have factual information that I can provide to the committee about these matters.
Okay, and finally, Convener, I wonder, do you have sight of the People Survey? It's an annual survey.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's all staff are invited to take part in the People Survey, and as a head of a division, I receive results about my division, and I, along with every other senior manager, I consider them very carefully in terms of what they tell me about the operation and staff sentiment of the colleagues who work for me. So it's a very important milestone in the course of the year for the Scottish Government.
So in from 2013 to 2016 and onwards, the People Surveys, did they raise any concerns about bullying and sexual harassment? And if so, how did that develop over that period?
Well, it's kind of at two levels. I think there's the corporate results for the SG as an overall entity that the People Survey reports on. The Permanent Secretary spoke about that last week. Then most business areas within the Scottish Government will then get local reports. So as a head of a division, I would get a local report about my division, which numbers about 25 staff. So that's very particular to my circumstances. So along with my team leaders who spend a lot of time analysing what that means, what staff are telling us, both at the corporate level and at the business area level, about things that we should be thinking about as managers as to how we can make sure that our staff's experience of working within the Scottish Government is as positive as possible.
On the sexual harassment and bullying?
Well, as I said, at the corporate level, Permanent Secretary identified the action that was being taken at that level. Within my own division, yes, there were results there. Because I've got a relatively small division, the results aren't identified. No individual can be identified. So these are results about, as I say in my case, about 25 people. So it's understanding what those results mean in terms of how I should be managing my division more effectively in light of what staff are saying.
Thank you.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Very much, Convener. Good morning, Mr Hind. Mr Hind, last week we learned that concerns have been raised informally about the conduct of the former First Minister, which may or may not have influenced the development of this policy. I'm not asking about whether those claims were based in fact. I'm just keen to understand what happened. Now, you said to Margaret Mitchell that you were not personally involved in or had factual information of allegations of misconduct. However, I want to know when you first learned that there were these concerns around, firstly, alleged bullying by the former First Minister.
Well, in terms of the, excuse me, tell me if I'm not answering your question, obviously, but in terms of the concerns and complaints that were raised under the procedure, the first I learnt about those was in August 2018, when there were newspaper reports about them. I knew nothing about those concerns.
Me for not being clearer, that's not what I was asking. Notwithstanding the procedure, I'm talking about the scuttlebutt, the rumour mill, the general sort of quiet mutterings and understandings of the culture at the time. That we already know that there were mutterings of that kind, that there were concerns about alleged misconduct, bullying or sexual inappropriate behaviour by the First Minister. When did you first learn about those rumours, those mutterings, not anything to do with this procedure?
Yeah, I'm finding that quite a difficult question to answer because you're kind of inviting me to comment or to reflect on rumour or
all I'm asking, if I can just dial back and say, what I'm trying to establish here is the culture in which this procedure was designed. Cultures have a formal process, but they also have an informal process. They have the organisational discussions that happen by water coolers. So thinking about those organisational discussions that happen by water coolers, when were you first made aware that there were informal concerns that had not materialised into a complaint about the former First Minister's behaviour?
I wasn't told anything of that sort in relation to the work I was doing on the procedure.
I'm not suggesting you were told directly, because that, I think, given your seniority, that might have been seen as an escalation. Were you aware that people in various arms of the civil service had concerns about the conduct of the First Minister?
Well, yes. I mean, things were said. Whether they were true or not, I have no idea.
Okay. And when, with that awareness, the knowledge of those concerns, did you ever share those with a high-ranking official in the SNP?
Never. No.
Did you ever share those concerns either with ministers or government special advisors?
No. Well, there wouldn't be concerns. I mean, as you've mentioned, scuttlebutt and rumour are hardly things to start raising formally with senior colleagues.
Okay. To your knowledge, was there ever an investigation of any of these concerns undertaken on an informal basis?
Not to my knowledge, no.
To your knowledge, were there any informal measures adopted to mitigate against those concerns or rumours?
I have no knowledge of anything.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, but perhaps you want to bring
Bring you back in afterwards, Alex. I think Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Hind. Last week, the Permanent Secretary said in her statement, and I quote directly from the official record, "As civil servants, every process that we create must be robust and fair and open to challenge and scrutiny. And she then went on to say creating a new human resource procedure was no different. Yet, firstly, it appears that trade union engagement was limited. We know from the PCS there was only one formal meeting of the harassment working group. Secondly, it's clear that this work was done at pace, from it being commissioned at Cabinet on the 31st of October to be signed off on the 20th December. Thirdly, it would appear there was no formal wider staff engagement other than an email from the Permanent Secretary at the beginning of November. And fourthly, we know that the draft policy was sent to one person, a potential claimant, a potential complainant, before it was signed off by the First Minister. Were you then confident that this policy was fair and robust, given that you were leading this work?
Yes, is the direct answer, Ms Constance. There was a team of colleagues, as we say in the statement that's been submitted, and I said in my opening remarks, there were a team of colleagues, professional advisors on legal matters, on HR matters, who were closely involved in working with me on a collaborative basis to develop the procedure and to engage as appropriately with other parties that might have something to contribute to the development of the procedure. We did work at pace. As you know, when a commission comes from Cabinet, it concentrates the mind, and we move quickly to deliver what Cabinet is asking for, and the First Minister is asking for. The engagement that took place with the trade unions was led by my colleague Nicola Richards, who will be appearing after me. The staff engagement, there were a number of messages from the Permanent Secretary, not just one that issued about the work, the review that had been commissioned. In some ways, this procedure is unlike other HR procedures. It's not something for general application by local managers. It's a procedure that would be dealt with by the centre of the organisation. So its development was perhaps not taken forward in a slightly different way from a normal HR policy of this sort. So the answer is yes, I'm sure it was robust, it was lawful, and it reflected best HR practice, courtesy of the expert professional input we had to the development of the procedure.
And your sources of information for best HR practice would be what?
The professional advice within government from the relevant part of government, dealing within People Directorate who give HR advice. Clearly, legal advice was taken at all appropriate moments, legal advice informed by employment law. Acas guidance was influential in terms of the design of the procedure and how it was developed. So I'm convinced in my mind that all relevant sources of expert advice were consulted and fed appropriately into the procedure.
Mr Hind, what can you tell us about the advice that the government received from Acas? Because the information that came to committee was pretty heavily redacted.
Yes, without trying to dodge the question, it might be this is where I was relying on my HR advisors to help me with the development of those parts of the procedure that reflected best HR practice. So, as I say, without dodging the question, it may be something that Nicola Richards, after me, would be better placed, given her role, to talk in detail about that.
Okay, and I'm sure we'll do that. Now, throughout the Permanent Secretary's contribution last week, she repeatedly stated that policy development was informed by legal and HR advice. At what points would policy development specifically engage with legal advice? How does this work?
As I said in my opening remarks, As you know, there are constraints in what I'm able to talk about in terms of legal advice. I can't talk about the content or the source, but I can confirm to the committee that legal advice was taken from the very first moment that the procedure began to be drafted on the 7th of November and all the way through to its publication.
Okay. And when people talk about the policy development being informed by legal advice, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean wholesale acceptance, or is legal advice taken and then adapted?
I think the development of the procedure was an iterative process. There were many, many versions of the procedure produced over the course of the period up till it was signed off on the 20th of December. Legal advice was sought at every stage and every point in its development to help shape the procedure so that what we ended up with was lawful.
Okay, I suppose I'm trying to clarify, does when legal advice informs a process, is that an implicit acceptance of legal advice or not?
Well, I think all I can say is that we've ended up with a procedure that the government regards as being lawful. It would not be lawful if it wasn't to the satisfaction of the appropriate legal advisors. So you may, I think, reasonably infer that the procedure that has been produced was informed on the basis of legal advice that was accepted to ensure that it was lawful.
Okay, and just to be clear, in terms of the policy work that you were leading, Mr. Hind, was the legal advice internal to the organisation, or was it coming from external?
I don't think I'm allowed to say the source of that legal advice, Ms. Constant.
Okay, I'm not asking you the source, I'm just asking in-house or out-house.
So I think that would indicate whether it was by definition in-house or out-house, outsourced. So I think I won't be drawn on that if it's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. No further questions just now.
I have a supplementary to Ms Constance's questions from Myrtle Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Hind. Just on this issue of legal advice that my colleague was pursuing, and specifically on this question of whether former First Ministers, former ministers would be considered as part of the policy. Did you had sight of legal advice on that specific point?
Yes. Yes. I'm just pausing, not because we didn't have legal advice, but would my answer disclose something that it shouldn't? But every aspect, including the first procedure that was produced on the 7th of November, dealt only with former ministers. And as I said to Ms Constance, we had legal advice from the outset. So the fact that the first procedure focused purely on former ministers, again, you can reasonably assume that legal advice was taken on that.
And was that advice definitive in its view that including former First Ministers former ministers within the policy would be legal?
Well, again, I'm sorry if this sounds I'm answering the question a slightly roundabout way, but the final procedure provides for former First Ministers. The final procedure we regard as a lawful document, a lawful procedure. Therefore, again, you can reasonably assume that legal advice was taken that supported that view.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Hind.
Morning.
I think you would be accurately described as a career civil servant.
Correct.
Excellent, thank you, because your knowledge will undoubtedly be extraordinarily helpful. I understand you saying that when a cabinet commissions something, there is a degree of speed required, and you produced a first draft of the policy within a week. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. The Cabinet paper on the 31st of October, and indeed the statement made to Parliament by, I believe it was John Swinney on the 31st of October, had no mention whatsoever of former ministers within either the Cabinet paper or the statement. So when was the inclusion of former ministers first made? If it appeared in your document, your very first document, who did you have the discussion with about that and when?
Yes. So you're right, the Cabinet paper and Mr Swinney's response to the topical question that day do not refer from memory to former ministers. So my involvement in this was, I attended Cabinet that day, as I normally do, apart from today, and I heard the discussion. In the days running up to that, clearly the First Minister wrote to the presiding officer on the Monday, the day before Cabinet, to express concerns. Those concerns that were being expressed were generated by, frankly, the rather unsavoury headlines that were emanating from Westminster and Whitehall about alleged behaviour down there. Given my ministerial code responsibilities, I was already thinking about if we had the same kind of allegations surfacing in Scotland, what would we do here? So my mind was already in this space when the Commission came from First Minister and Cabinet to review the policies and procedures. I was already in the space of thinking that the gap that we had in Scotland was in respect of allegations being made against former ministers. As is set out in the Scottish Government's report to the committee, a complaint against a current minister could be considered using two approaches. First Minister could consider it under the Ministerial Code, and we also had the Fairness at Work policy that had a section in it relating to complaints against ministers, but there was nothing about former ministers. So that was a gap I identified, and it was my decision in terms of taking work forward on the development of a procedure that referred only at that stage to former ministers.
Very significant inclusion, and I'd be keen to understand whether you just conjured this up yourself or whether you actually had any discussions before putting it into the first draft.
The discussions that were had at official level with people like Nicola Richards and others who, in People Directorate, who were looking at a wider review of Scottish Government policies and procedures in line with the Cabinet Commission. My involvement is on the Scottish Ministerial Code and giving advice on ministerial standards of behaviour.
I absolutely get that, but what I'm trying to identify is in that first week, for what was quite a significant inclusion, did you speak to anybody about that? Did you send a minute, a memo, anything at all? Or is this entirely just down to you? Because you could not have been unaware of the significance of the inclusion, and therefore I would have thought you would have checked with some of your civil service colleagues. Now, you've mentioned Nicola Richards and others. Who are the others?
Colleagues in People Directorate, and also seeking legal advice on these matters.
Did you speak to the Permanent Secretary?
I did not speak to the Permanent Secretary at that point because this was the development of a draft procedure that would in due course come forward for the Permanent Secretary and the First Minister to sign off. So I was developing a proposition. It was not the settled procedure at that point. It wouldn't be settled for a number of weeks to come.
You also said that you based this on discussions that you heard around the Cabinet table. Did those discussions mention former ministers?
They did not, no. I would need to look again in detail at the Cabinet minute the extract we've supplied, but from memory there was no reference to former ministers in that discussion.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask you who drove this process? Because the Permanent Secretary seemed to suggest at our last meeting that she wasn't really that involved. So I'm curious to know kind of, what was the communication between you during that process? Was it fairly regular? Was it daily? Was it by email, verbally? How did you
communication
report
with
back?
Miss Bailey?
The Perm Sec.
With the Permanent Secretary. I spoke to the Permanent Secretary probably 2 or 3 times over the course of the development of the procedure. Spoke more frequently with her private office, her private secretaries, who were clearly keeping a close watch on the overall review and my contribution to that. So there was some direct involvement with the Permanent Secretary and indirect involvement through her private office.
Okay, Thank you. Can I ask you about independence within the process and refer to document YY073, which is a memorandum from Judith McKinnon dated 7th of November, and it suggests that allegations against former ministers should be investigated independently. You agreed with that, didn't you?
So could I ask you what footnote that is?
Oh, I have no idea what footnote that is. I have it as a memo on the 7th of November from Judith McKinnon, and the document number I have is YY073.
I'll just take a moment to locate it, if that's okay. In fact, I think I may. So this is a note from Judith McKinnon dated 7th November, 10:38.
It could well be 10:38. You are much more precise than I am.
Sorry,
But
do
I
you
can-
have the document there?
I've got a whole
No, it's okay.
pile of documents.
If you're prepared to rely on that, I've tracked down the right one.
Yes, I do indeed believe you. I can't believe
Thank
there
you.
would be more than one email at 10:38, so I will defer to you on that.
Thank you.
But the content of the memo suggests that allegations against former ministers should be investigated independently. My understanding is you agreed with that. Why didn't it ever happen?
And what are you basing on that I agreed with it? Because I'm not sure I did.
Because my understanding is that there are further emails from you agreeing with that proposition that the committee don't have. You might want to go back and look and perhaps furnish the committee with those emails.
Identify those emails.
Okay. Did you? Well, let me pose the question to you. Did you think that independent investigation was a useful thing to have of former ministers?
And I suppose I would ask, what did that mean in practice? I mean, the procedure provided at paragraph 10 of the procedure that somebody not involved in the matter under investigation would act as investigating officer.
Sure.
So somebody who was independent of the allegations would undertake. Now, there's another way to read it, of course, is it some third party outside government. And I'm not sure if that's what Judith was meaning there. My view is that, and I can remember discussing this with Nicola Richards, is that for essentially the procedure is an internal HR document within government, and most HR procedures of this sort would be dealt with internally before any external independent role might be envisaged. So it felt, on the basis of the advice I had, including the legal advice and including HR best practice, that where we ended up with is having an investigating officer who was not directly involved in the incident was the appropriate way to design the procedure. Now, there are other arguments. I accept there are other arguments, but and we're not blind to those. Other organisations do use independent investigators.
Did you yourself not suggest, indeed, 3 names of people, independent people, who could provide advice?
Yes.
You did. The committee doesn't have that
Right,
email,
okay. Well,
unfortunately.
they were Scottish Government civil servants. They were not independent third parties to government.
Okay.
So that was what I was agreeing with. That where I had taken the procedure was that the investigation would be done by a Scottish Government official, unconnected to the matter being investigated, and I offer some potential names of who those individuals might be, but they were not external to government.
Okay, can I ask a final question in this section, Convener, very short? You sought Cabinet Office's opinion on the policy to include former ministers in an email and got quite an uncomfortable response. Did you go back to them? Did you even reply to their point about, including former civil servants? I'm curious to know what happened thereafter.
To be honest, I didn't go back to them. There was a high degree of caution being expressed by Cabinet Office colleagues. They were referring me to a process that was underway within Whitehall, being led by a former permanent secretary now down there. And they were asking, would it make sense for us to wait the outcome of that review before taking action? Given the commission from the Cabinet, given that the First Minister had written to the presiding officer given that the First Minister was keen to take national leadership on these matters, that the Permanent Secretary was keen that her duty of care to staff was as full and comprehensive as it might be, delaying what turned out to be till September 2018 did not feel an option to me.
Thank you, Convener.
I have short supplementaries, please, from Alex Cole-Hamilton and Maureen Watt. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I, in relation to the role of Judith McKinnon, first of all, can I ask, when were you first aware that the procedure had been, or drafts of the procedure had been shared with people who would then go on to become complainants?
That was later in 2018, and I think it was possibly connected to the judicial review process when it became known to me that the draft procedure had been shared with those who were raising concerns.
Is that common practice, would you say?
I think the Permanent Secretary covered this point last week, Mr. Cole-Hamilton, when she talked about the increasing tendency for government to share drafts or developments, drafts of procedures in development with those who may have experience to offer. But I wasn't involved in any of the decisions around sharing with any of those who are raising concerns, so I don't know the context as to why it was done in that particular occasion.
I've still got two more questions, but if you can
I'll
come
try
back
and
to me.
bring you back in, but I'm very aware of the time.
Okay.
Yeah, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Hine. Could I just go back and tease out some things in relation to the survey, the People's Survey itself? 10% of Scottish Government staff had faced bullying or harassment. That's 10% of roughly how many?
Again, I'm not wanting to be unhelpful, Ms. Watt, but Nicola Richards would be much better placed to answer these questions than me, given she acts as a corporate level on People Directorate.
Okay, but given you have a role in terms of, you know, marrying, if you like, the internal policy on harassment with the Ministerial Code, I think it is important to ask this next question. It says, respondents were able to seek, in relation to encountering bullying or harassment, respondents were able to select multiple categories. It then goes on to say the majority of incidents of bullying or harassment came from colleagues, 117, direct managers, 117, or managers in the same part of the organisation, 123. Where do ministers of the government fit into that?
I couldn't answer that question, I'm afraid. It's not my area of responsibility.
Well, it seems to me important because, you know, that seems quite a lot of incidents and people saying that they had bullying, experienced bullying or harassment. You know, it'd be interesting to know how that was followed up, not just in terms of government ministers, but also in terms of the organisation as a whole.
Yes, I'm sure Nicola Richards will be able to give you chapter and verse on that.
To Alison Johnson, I just got a query, Mr. Hyde. The Westminster Review was discussed last week with Leslie Evans as well. Could you tell us what the outcome of the Westminster Review was?
It was a report produced by Sue Owens, Dame Sue Owens, a former Permanent Secretary, that described, I think, some of her findings, some of the cultural issues that had been identified as a result of the work that she did. It produced some recommendations. It did not produce a procedure of the sort we have for dealing with complaints against either current or former ministers. I think it still remains the case in Whitehall, as far as I know, that complaints against current ministers will be considered under the Ministerial Code. There is no bespoke standalone procedure for dealing with such complaints. And I'm not aware they've got anything at all for former ministers. So it was quite a descriptive report with some recommendations. I didn't see, and I still don't see, any hard product coming out of it.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Hind. So the Scottish Cabinet meeting of Tuesday, 31st of October, which my colleague Jackie Bailey has referred to. Paragraph 38 says that while there was no suggestion that the current arrangements were ineffective, the First Minister had also asked the Permanent Secretary to undertake a review of the Scottish Government's policies and processes to ensure that they were fit for purpose. Can I just confirm, Mr Hind, is it correct that you led the development and drafting of a new procedure that could be applied in respect to former ministers? Okay. And the timeline prepared by the Scottish Government indicates that the internal assessment identified, and you've already referred to this, that there was a gap in terms of having a procedure that could be deployed should any historical complaints arise in Scotland.
Yes, correct.
Yes. Now, with regards to, the convener has just touched on this point too, the methodology for drafting the policy and any precedent used to inform the drafting process. I'm interested to learn what discussions you might have had with other administrations or governments within the UK, and you've noted that there is no similar policy in place at UK government level.
Yes.
Was this something that you would discuss with civil service colleagues?
Within other governments. Well, we obviously reached out to the Cabinet Office and we got nothing back, if I can put it that way, in terms of any template that we could use here. We looked around other administrations as well, and there was nothing obvious that we could use here. So effectively, I was starting from scratch in the development of this procedure. As far as we know, it remains the only procedure of its type. So I was using my experience of a number of years of being involved in with offering advice on the ministerial code. So I knew what kind of areas I should be drafting. I was getting advice from legal colleagues, from HR colleagues. So I, sat down one day with a blank sheet of paper and started writing, and that was a process that led to the development of the final procedure as agreed by First Minister and Permanent Secretary.
So currently it is the case that this procedure, which can be applied to former ministers, is unique to the Scottish Parliament?
To the Scottish Government?
To the Scottish Government?
Yes, as far as I know, we haven't seen any others since that would be relevant for former ministers. I know there was also engagement, not directly by me, but with People Directorate colleagues with Parliament itself, who were going through the same process of thinking about its own procedures in terms of harassment and bullying, and has produced its own standalone procedure as well. So, quite a number of organisations were grappling with these issues in the aftermath of the Me Too campaign, and particularly within Scottish Government in light of some of the allegations emerging from Westminster.
Did you have any feedback or input at all, even informal, from colleagues, say, in Westminster? Were any concerns expressed about the development of this policy in Scotland, or were they looking at the work that you were undertaking and thinking, perhaps that's something we might wish to pursue ourselves in future?
I was in exchange with Ms Bailey then about the engagement with the Cabinet Office, and clearly they were, I think, uncomfortable, as they said in their email, about where we were getting to. I think it was because we were potentially ahead of them in terms of the development of a policy of this sort.
So their concern was purely that they would, perhaps be perceived as being inactive?
Well, I don't want to put words in their mouth because it was never expressed in that way, but we took the decision in light of that response that there was a direct commission to us from the First Minister, supported by the Permanent Secretary, that we need to make sure that we had a comprehensive suite of up-to-date, fit-for-purpose policies and procedures. And the gap I identified and subsequently agreed to by the Permanent Secretary and the First Minister was we had a gap in respect of former ministers that needed to be filled.
Why do you think it was the case that up until this point in time there was no such policy?
In respect of former ministers? I mean, it's not a straightforward thing to do. So there's some of the practical issues. So if by the end of 2017, a former minister of another party would not have been in office for over 10 years. So we're dealing with issues that are quite historical in nature. What is the understanding? What is the evidence within government for any allegations that are raised? So it's not a simple thing. It was the right thing to do, I think, to fill the gap. But maybe in time gone by, because of those complexities and difficulties of crafting a procedure, it was not addressed. But of course, we had all the Me Too movement and some of the specific allegations that were the catalyst, I think, for us and ministers wanting to do something on that occasion.
Thank you. I have one final question, Convener, if I may. With regards to the robustness of the application of the procedure, when we finally have the procedure, colleagues have touched on this too, and the need to designate a senior civil servant as an investigating officer to deal with a complaint, and the absolute, it's absolutely essential that that person is seen to be wholly independent and not involved in any way, shape or form with anyone involved in the case. Would you agree that clearly there was a failure to implement that robustly, and that led to the outcome of the judicial review?
Yes, I think the First Minister has been, the Permanent Secretary has been clear that the way the procedure was applied and that part of the procedure could give the appearance of there being bias. There wasn't bias, but it could give the appearance of bias in the way that part of the procedure was applied. That therefore had the consequences for the judicial review case. The procedure itself remains extant, it's in place, it remains lawful in the way I've described. So there's no fundamental concerns about the procedure. It was about the way it was applied and the potential for apparent bias.
Within, while this was happening in real time, were any concerns being raised about the perceived lack of independence in this situation?
So what time we were talking about here, Ms Johnson?
Well, I'm just wondering if any colleagues were perhaps raising concerns about the independence of the investigative officer, or was it something that only came to light as a result of the judicial review?
Well, not to my understanding. I wasn't involved, so I didn't know there was any contact. I didn't know there were any people coming forward with concerns or complaints, and I didn't know there was engagement with them by the person who would be the appointed investigating officer. So I had no first-hand knowledge of those things.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Alistair Allen, please, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. At our last meeting, in fact, the Permanent Secretary explained what she called, and what I think you've called as well, the iterative process that led to the development of the policy. She indicated that there was very limited involvement by ministers in that process, but had that involvement some involvement from special advisors?
Yes. As is noted in the report that's been submitted, the First Minister's Chief of Staff had involvement at one or 2 points in the development of the procedure.
Am I right in thinking that special advisors are regularly copied into very large numbers of emails in terms of government, the development of government policy, or was there something unusual about the degree to which special advisors were involved in this?
The development of this procedure did not generate large volumes of emails to large copy lists. Now, the review that was undertaken and this work was not a secret. The First Minister had talked about it clearly, Mr Swinney had talked about it in public, Permanent Secretary had indicated to the organisation that this review was underway, so it wasn't being done in secret. But nevertheless, there was a reasonably small number of colleagues who were involved, who had a business reason to be involved in the development of the procedure. I was not routinely copying in Liz Lloyd, Chief of Staff, but there were a couple of occasions when The Chief of Staff was copied into emails and commented on them, and I think those emails have been disclosed to the committee.
On that point, one occasion when the Chief of Staff was included was, I'm referring back here to document XX013, but I think you'll be familiar with it, probably without thumbing through it, but you're welcome to take a pause to do so if you wish. This is the email exchange where it was commented that there were still some tricky questions not yet agreed. Are you able to say a little more about what some of these tricky questions were? This was
Could you just remind me what
XX013.
013.
It's part of a draft letter from the First Minister to the Permanent Secretary.
I'm not sure I am able to put my hand quite on that paper immediately, but I do know the exchanges that were had with the Chief of Staff around that time. And I think it was at the 17th of November, around that
yes.
date, Dr. Allen. Yes, I mean, the procedure was still in draft at that point. We've been working on it clearly 10 days or so. It had gone through various iterations. But at that point, if I can just check my notes, yes, by the 17th of November, we had moved the procedure on from dealing with former ministers, but also to include current ministers and also to include former ministers of other parties. So the procedure had, through the iterative process, developed quite a bit further. The Chief of Staff's interest at that time, and I think that's identified in the report that's been submitted, was to ensure that there was an appropriate recognition of the First Minister's responsibilities and a separation of responsibilities between the First Minister and the Permanent Secretary. Now, the exchanges that I had with the Chief of Staff, particularly at a meeting the 24th of November, where the Chief of Staff indicated that the procedure should be developed further to remove the role of the First Minister in deciding how to investigate complaints received against particularly current ministers, that it would, where the drafting moved to as a result of that, was that the Permanent Secretary would, if she felt there was a case to answer again regarding a complaint against a current minister, the Permanent Secretary would automatically trigger the investigation without recourse to the First Minister. So in some ways it was a, as it were, it was a strengthening of the independence of the procedure from First Minister. It put the responsibility for that onto the Permanent Secretary to decide whether to initiate the investigation against a current minister. So the engagements I had with the Chief of Staff, she was reflecting what she felt was the First Minister's view, that the First Minister should have less and less involvement in the operation of the procedure at an operational level.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Now, everyone has supplementaries to this section of questioning. So I'm very aware that both Maureen Watt and Murdo Fraser haven't been able to put their particular questions. So we'll do that first and then we'll do a round-up. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Hind, can I just get a flavour of how much independence you have from the rest of the UK civil service in developing policies? So, for example, the internal bullying and harassment policy, how much does it have to align, given that civil servants can move around the rest of the UK as a whole? how much does it align with the policies in other parts of the UK?
Well, there is no obligation on the Scottish Government to follow the same policies and procedures developed by other government departments. The Permanent Secretary's responsibility for ensuring the health and well-being and has a care of duty to all staff within the Scottish Government, and has an obligation therefore to ensure that all policies and procedures are appropriately judged to deliver her duty and her responsibilities. Like other parts of government, when we're developing policies and procedures, we will want to make sure, as we did in this case, that they are lawful and reflect best practice. So clearly, my colleagues in People Directorate will be speaking to their counterparts in other government departments and in the Cabinet Office on a regular basis about the development of policies. But as we saw in this instance, when there was a need for a distinctive Scottish solution, we proceeded on the basis of developing something that suited Scottish circumstances.
Thank you. And you were responsible for the revision of the Ministerial Code in the light of the survey and the review of the policies internally to the civil service. How much did the Ministerial Code have to be revised, and what exactly were those revisions?
Yes, the Ministerial Code was revised and a fresh version published in February 2018. For the most part, the First Minister decided, and it's her code, that the revisions in the 2018 edition would reflect, I think, almost to the letter, the same changes that were being made by the Prime Minister to the UK Ministerial Code. Those changes reflected some particular instances of behaviours on the part of ministers and former ministers. So the parts of the code that were strengthened were around the behaviours of ministers in relation to the civil service and others, in relation to bullying and harassment. There were also some changes made about notification of meetings on the back of the issues around Priti Patel that caused her to resign. And there were some distinctive entries that we put in to the First Minister put into the Scottish Ministerial Code in respect of the new Lobbying Act in Scotland. So there are a number of quite discrete changes made to the Scottish Ministerial Code that by and large reflected the same changes being made at UK level.
And in your experience, have these changes seen a results, a change in the culture in the organisation and the interaction with ministers? In other words, in subsequent surveys of staff, has there been a difference and a decline in the numbers experiencing bullying and harassment?
Again, at the risk of sounding unhelpful, I'm probably not the right person to give you a deep data analysis of the corporate people survey results and what the trends are. I think the Permanent Secretary talked a little about those last week and indicated that the results for Scottish Government were at, I think, the highest level ever in terms of positive outcomes. So that suggests we're getting something right, but I'm sure Nicola Richards will be able to give you more detail on those issues than I can.
But in terms of your day-to-day experience, do you think there has been a shift?
Well, the day-to-day experience of ministers complying with the Scottish Ministerial Code remains very high. Ministers take the Ministerial Code very seriously indeed and make every effort to ensure that they comply with it at all times.
Margaret Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I have a follow-up to Alistair Allen's question and then one other substantive question which I can ask now if you wish, Convener. But my follow-up to the line of questioning from Alistair Allen, Mr Hind, is around the involvement of the First Minister's Chief of Staff, Liz Lloyd, in relation to the policy development. And it is clear from the information we've seen that she was involved in the development of the policy. Is that typical for a political appointment, a special advisor, to be involved in drawing up a policy of this nature?
This is, for the reasons I said earlier, quite a distinctive policy because it engages both the responsibilities of the Permanent Secretary in terms of her duty of care to staff, so therefore it has an HR dimension to it as well, but also directly engages with the First Minister's responsibility under the Scottish Ministerial Code. So a normal HR process, I don't think would go anywhere near a special advisor. Nicola Richards will be able to say more about that than I can, but those would be matters for the civil service functioning of the organisation, unlikely to be matters that we would engage a special advisor about. But when we're dealing with the First Minister's responsibilities under the Scottish Ministerial Code, that would be entirely legitimate for the Chief of Staff to become engaged in that.
Thank you. So in effect, there are two distinct parts to this. So it was the latter part where you would expect a
Correct.
political appointment to be involved.
Correct.
Thank you. If I can ask just one other question, Convener, and then I'm done. And that's going back to the question of Cabinet oversight of the policy and the policy formation. Now, we know that the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, was the Cabinet lead on the matter as the most senior male figure. He was the one who was asked to respond to the topical question in Parliament on the 31st of October 2017. And yet, from the information we've had, it appears that he did not have any role in the development of policy. Again, is that not unusual?
Not in this instance. I mean, Mr Swinney's decision, as agreed at Cabinet on the 31st, was that he would lead for the government in the answer to the topical question to signal quite clearly that this is that the Me Too campaign, the allegations that had been raised, required men to review their own behaviours. So he was signalling that on behalf of the government. He did not, therefore, as a consequence, take on responsibility for the whole of the review or for the Scottish Ministerial Code. The Scottish Ministerial Code remains ultimately a matter for the First Minister to decide how her responsibilities under the code are discharged.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I have some quick supplementaries from members who have listened to evidence from others. And if they could be quick, it would be appreciated. Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Again, at the Cabinet on the 31st of October 2017, the Permanent Secretary indicated that issues of former ministers were not discussed at Cabinet specifically, but the context of the Commission was made clear that it could be historic matters of concern, and that the context actually did refer to the fact that many of these were long-standing issues. Now, given that your lead of the development of drafting of the new procedure, which could be applied to former ministers, did you seek more information to better understand how this procedure would work?
Well, to break that into two parts, the commission from Cabinet was a commission effectively without limits. It was to review all policies and procedures and to identify how they could be made fit for purpose. I interpreted that to also mean, is there anything that's not covered that needs to be covered, which is why I identified the gap in relation to former ministers. What I was producing was a draft that would then be approved or put for approval to the Permanent Secretary and the First Minister. So I was not deciding myself that this is going to be the procedure for the Scottish Government. For the reasons I've just explained to Mr Fraser, the Permanent Secretary and the First Minister both have responsibilities, separate and distinct responsibilities in terms of the procedure. Therefore, they were both asked to sign it off at the appropriate point. In terms of the development of the procedure, as I said earlier, there was a small team of us working on it collaboratively, pulling in appropriate professional advice. So we developed the procedure in the way we thought best reflected the gap that had been identified.
Right, so was it your position you just accepted that it would inform former ministers without, requiring any more information about why?
Yes, I was acting on the basis of the Commission. I was interpreting it in the way I thought would be most helpful and give some added value to the review and options that could then go up to the First Minister and the Permanent Secretary about how the totality of policies and procedures could be as comprehensive as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Convener, we now know that this procedure would be tested in its absolute infancy, and before its ink was even dry, it would trigger allegations, probably the most explosive allegations in Scottish political history. Given that this was ultimately your brainchild, the procedure was your commission, were you consulted in the appointment of an investigating officer by the Director of People?
I wasn't.
Okay. Did you seek to intervene proactively to ask about the status of these complaints, given the gravity of their status, but also given your knowledge that some of these people, or that the document had been shared with people who would later go on to become complainers?
Just so I'm clear, if I wasn't earlier, the first I heard about any allegations, and the first was, I think, the 24th of August 2018, when there were press reports. I knew nothing before then about any complainer, anybody raising concerns. I knew nothing about the appointment of any investigating officer and any sharing of the draft procedure with any individual. So once I had developed a procedure, once it had been signed off, I stood back, rightly so, from any application of the procedure.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Hind, on the 22nd of November, when the First Minister wrote to the Permanent Secretary commissioning the policy, she included the phrase former ministers, including those of previous administrations, regardless of party. Wasn't that the exact phrase that was suggested by the Chief of Staff to the then PPS of the Permanent Secretary in an email exchange, which I believe is XX013, and your response XX014?
Footnote? No. Oh.
I don't follow the footnotes. I follow what the clerks give us.
Right, well, I'll never find it.
Okay. I'm happy to send that to you.
Thank you. So I think if I make correct one point, that the note from the First Minister to the Permanent Secretary on the 22nd of November was not the Commission. The Commission stemmed from the Cabinet meeting on the 31st of October. The note from the First Minister that you referred to that talked about inviting the Permanent Secretary to make sure that any review reflected former ministers, we were already there. We were doing it from the 7th of November, so it was already covered. So it didn't introduce anything new that we weren't already doing.
No, the file name, interestingly, is Permanent Secretary Review Commission, 17th of November. So I'm just using the language that the Civil Service used to describe this.
Footnote 23.
Thank you.
Beg pardon?
Footnote 23.
Footnote 23, which is the biggest footnote in the whole.
Well, that's the Scottish Government's submission then. Nothing to do with us.
No, I mean, I won't take up the committee's time. I don't think.
I'm just curious whether that's the exact wording that was suggested by the Chief of Staff, because what we have is a set of emails at XX013 to the PS Perm Secretary, then forwarded to you, and then your reply. So, I mean, I'm happy if you wanted to write to the committee afterwards.
Yes, I mean, I'll follow up. The email, the note from the First Minister that issued on the 22nd was circulating in draft before then, and I think I commented from memory again that, you know, we're doing this. But the First Minister, I think, was keen for the record and for the avoidance of doubt to make sure that the procedure or whatever review we were undertaking covered former ministers. So,
Sure.
you know,
I just need confirmation that that was the phrase used by the Chief of Staff that then made it into the 22nd of November letter.
I shall look into that.
Thank you. And if you would also, Convener, provide the emails that I referred to earlier that were missing from the bundle given to the committee.
In terms of the names of those.
Yeah, so there were clearly other emails where you've exchanged information about, you know, independent advisors, and unfortunately these don't seem to have been provided to the committee.
I'll look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a quick couple of points of clarification, please, Mr Hines, before we wind up this session. You've said a few times now that you had no knowledge of the complaints and you were developing the policy as per your role. But the committee has heard, and indeed we've had it submitted to us, that lived experience was deemed to be very important, and one complainant was given a copy of the policy in draft form. So when it came back, it more than likely reviewed and changes made. Can you confirm that at that point, were you not aware that a complainant had been given a copy of the draft policy?
I wasn't aware at the time. During the development of the procedure, I wasn't aware, and I wasn't aware for many months thereafter. I have, in light of the discussion last week and the timeline that we've produced, reviewed the point when that document was shared with one of the individuals who's to become a complainer, and I think it was shared on the 14th of December. The procedure, after all of these iterations, was, I think, at or very close to being in its final form. So my memory is, looking at the drafting of the procedure, is that nothing came back that I can see as a result of that sharing that caused any changes to be made to the procedure.
Okay, thank you for that. And my final point is follows on from what Ms Bailey was saying about the missing documents. There's obviously been a lot of key meetings where policy development changed as a result of comments. Are you aware of additional records that have not been provided to this committee?
Well, clearly there is one we've identified there. Others, I'm very happy to go back and have a look. I mean, it feels to me that, I don't know how many documents there are, kind of 150 plus. It feels to me that, you know, there's a very clear setting out of the process for the development of the procedure from its earliest days, 7th of November, through to sign off on the 20th of December. So it felt to me, reading it, that all of the material points were covered in what's been disclosed. So all I can say is I'm very happy to go back with colleagues and have a look.
Thank you, Mr Hines. So we're going to have, no doubt, you'll be looking at the official report and supplying the information that's been requested. And thank you for your offer to have a look at other material and send it on to us. All that's left is to thank you for your contribution. Thank you for coming along to the committee. And I now suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. The meeting is reconvened and I welcome Nicola Richards, Director of People in the Scottish Government. Can I begin, please, by inviting Ms Richards to take the solemn affirmation? If you would raise your right hand, please, and then repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. I now invite Ms Richards to make a very brief opening statement to explain her role in the Scottish Government and the development of the complaints procedure.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, members. Convener, these opening words aim to give context about my role and responsibilities as Director of People, specifically with regard to the development of the harassment procedure. I have been in the Scottish Government's People Directorate since late 2010, initially on the learning and organisational development side, and have led the overall directorate since May 2016. The directorate has around 250 staff, covering a wide range of responsibilities and technical expertise, so my role is one of strategic direction and management oversight. The Scottish Government is a fair work employer, and this is reflected in our approach to equality, mental health and well-being. We have a public sector duty under the Equality Act to eliminate unlawful discrimination, which includes sexual harassment. Bullying harassment is not and never has been acceptable in the workplace. As the Permanent Secretary set out in earlier evidence, the Me Too movement in 2017 added momentum to a range of work which was already underway through our People Plan to tackle bullying and harassment and promote an inclusive workplace. During this period, what Cabinet described as a watershed moment, my role involved coordinating various strands of work, from staff communications to accelerating internal policy reviews and ensuring that the Permanent Secretary was regularly briefed across the full range of activity. In relation to the review commissioned by Cabinet and the development of the Ministerial Harassment procedure, I worked in close partnership with Cabinet Secretariat, legal and HR professional colleagues on its development to ensure the Commission was fulfilled. Finally, as was set out last week, I am giving evidence to the committee on behalf of ministers and not in a personal capacity. This is complex legal territory, so I ask the committee's forbearance if I have to seek advice or follow up in writing with detail to ensure accuracy and that all the government's legal duties are fulfilled. And finally, given that they have been invited to engage with this inquiry, I would also wish to declare that I'm a member of the union FDA. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Ms Richards, and I'll now ask committee members to give their questions to you. Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Richards, you've indicated that you took your present role in May 2006, but you were in the director previous to that. So can you confirm that that previous experience helped you to understand how the Fairness to Work policy was working in practice and any potential gaps?
Thank you. Just to clarify, my role in People Directorate between 2010 and 2014 was largely on the learning and development side, so I would have had less involvement at that point with the Fairness at Work policy. Around August 2014, I expanded my role and that then took on some more of the HR policy side, but not the direct bullying and harassment investigation side of things, so less in that area. I think on Fairness at Work more generally, it serves us reasonably well, I think, as an overall policy. It is reasonably unremarkable in that way. The provision relating to ministers that exists within Fairness at Work and has been in Fairness at Work since 2010, I think by early 2017, there was starting to be a sense that we should look at that again, partly because it doesn't lock in as clearly as it could do with the Ministerial Code, and that was one of the issues that we sought to resolve through the new procedure. And I think if we work ahead, we do have a commitment to review our wider policies, including Fairness at Work, and I think over time we would probably move towards a more kind of standalone set of policies and procedures rather than just having one overall setting in that way. But, you know, these things are always open to continued development.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I ask, given your role as head of HR of the complaints, did you have involvement in the partnership agreement, and with talks or informal discussions with the Council of Government Unions? And if so, can you say what issues regarding complaints, either informal or formal, about bullying or sexual harassment were raised with you between you taking post in May 2016 and until about August 2017?
Sorry, just to clarify, does that mean all bullying and harassment for,
Yeah.
across
Yeah,
civil
for-
servants, or just for
well,
ministers?
Involving current foreign ministers, and any other general issues that you would like to flag up as being of concern that was raised.
Okay, and obviously you'll understand that it's probably not appropriate for me to go into the detail of individual
just generally.
cases,
Yeah.
understandably. We have had, under the ministerial process, we have handled two issues under the Fairness at Work process involving ministers, involving current ministers. One of those was resolved at the informal stage, and that occurred at the early part of 2017. And there is another complaint that is still in progress, so I won't go into further detail about that one, but it is still at the informal stage.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I finally ask just about the people plans? Is this a UK survey? And is the survey that is put out in Scotland changed in any way, or are there standard questions, and were any new questions added in 2016?
Yeah, the People Survey is a UK civil service initiative, so it covers, I think, about 109 different organisations, all of the big UK departments, pretty much all of the agencies and bodies. So it's very much a core question set. Every year there's kind of a bidding process where you can try and get your local questions included within the wider question set. So at various points we've added questions that we felt were particularly relevant to initiatives that we had underway. For example, around monthly conversations, which is a kind of a well-being-led process that we try to have for our staff. So we included questions relating to monthly conversations. I think they would have come in ahead of 2016. I think probably the major change that has been made at a UK level to the survey that might be of interest to the committee in recent years was in 2019 was the first year that the survey had a breakdown of different sorts of harassment, because the bullying and harassment is quite a big catch-all, and there's a lot that gets covered within that. But in this year's survey it broke down, so sexual harassment is actually an individual item within that wider list. But my recollection was that that was a UK initiative rather than one that was specifically, I don't think we would have an opportunity to shape those particular kinds of questions.
Just to be clear, there was nothing added on the instigation of the Scottish Government to the 2016 survey specifically about, former complaints and historic issues? Or any question added specifically to the 2016 survey at the request of the Scottish Government?
I would need to check what local questions we put forward that year, because each year we do put forward local questions. I think it would be very unusual for us to ask for questions as specific as that. It's a general survey, it's very widely responded to, we get a very good response rate, and it isn't for individuals. It's very clear that it's an anonymous survey. It isn't the route to raise issues. It's the route for you to identify concerns at a kind of broader cultural level. But it's not the route by which an individual would raise an individual issue. And it's always very important that staff understand that.
I'd be grateful if you could check back and confirm that. Thank you.
Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Ms Richards. We heard from James Hind earlier, who advised that you led all the work in relation to trade union agreement and engagement with regards to the policy development. Can you therefore explain why it would appear that trade union engagement appeared quite limited, given that there was only one formal meeting of the harassment working group?
I think, as James set out, it's quite an unusual policy, this one. It's not, normally we would have a very extensive process with our trade unions when we were looking to bring in a policy that was going to be, if it was a full refit of fairness at work, it would be a very, very significant undertaking. This policy is slightly different because essentially the First Minister gets to decide. So the degree of union involvement is slightly different to how it would be normally. I think what was very clear from the exchanges with the unions from the earlier stages of this, that their absolute commitment was that the Scottish Government did not step away from having a policy related to complaints about ministers. That was their overriding concern, was that we stuck with the commitment that had been in place since 2010 in fairness at work. So my sense of all of the engagements that we'd had with the unions during that time was their concern was that we didn't water that down, that we didn't step back from that. They were perfectly content with there being kind of procedural changes, improvements to that, but I didn't perceive any particular difficulties there. The reassurance that we were seeking to give the unions through that time was that the Scottish Government was not looking to step away from having a process by which policies around ministers would be handled.
Okay, and obviously we'll hear more directly from the trade unions at a future session. But in the submissions received to committee from, I think it was the PCS, they expressed some commentary around that there was the stage 1 of the policy development, but then stage 2 just was paused and shelved. Can you explain why that was and whether work around stage 2 is proceeding or not?
Yes, I think it's a good question. This is part of stage 2, I think, is part of the answer. And stage 2 will also be the external review of the procedure that Laura Dunlop will take part in. I think because of the way in which circumstances have developed, it's been very difficult to finalise our work around fairness at work, to be able to take the ministerial aspect out of fairness at work and put that into a new standalone policy, because the procedure for that you're looking at today was under such a lot of scrutiny. It was very difficult, therefore, to do further work to that until all of these processes had completed. So there is still unfinished business there.
And the Permanent Secretary last week, in her opening remarks, said, we have already learned early lessons, and she was referring to procedural failures, from your experience, and that these lessons had been learned as part of the work being led by our People Directorate. So what have you learned?
A lot. Get another job, that kind of thing. It's been, a pretty exceptional period. I think I have learnt that whilst you can be fairly clear of all of the ground that you're standing on in terms of the advice and the legal position, that there are times when you may have to step very, very carefully in the way in which things are applied, if that is going to meet some of the very significant tests that might be placed upon it. I think it would be very challenging for any workplace policy to withstand the kind of scrutiny and test that this policy has been through. And certainly, I think if the work that you would do to set out a set of operating principles, if you like, a set of operating guidance, if you were putting this kind of thing in place, they would go into a lot of detail, particularly about roles and, kind of perceptions.
Reflective of you, I suppose I'm more interested in specifics in and around process and tasks. So if I can put to you that it would also appear that wider, more formal staff engagement appeared limited. We know, there was at least one message to staff emanating from the Permanent Secretary. But in terms of formal two-way engagement with staff, above and beyond engagement with trade unions, where was that meaningful engagement?
Oh, certainly. In terms of all of our policy development, we would have that absolutely at the heart. And I think it's in relation to the standard policies that we would work through that would need to be applied by local managers. You would want to have a very extensive range of engagement based on that.
Was it applied? Because it's not apparent to the information.
Sorry, in the
that
development
received.
of this procedure. No, as I explained, I think in the development of this procedure, because of its unique
So that's
nature.
different.
Yeah.
So this one was a bit outside the
Yeah.
norm.
Because
Okay.
of the First Minister's role.
And in terms of, you'll have heard this mentioned before as well, that on the 14th of December, the draft policy was sent to one person, someone who at that time was a potential complainer, and that was before it was signed off by the First Minister. And we've heard people make reference to the importance of lived experience, and also others have said, you know, that information was shared, but there was no changes made to the final stages of this policy. Given the absence of wider staff engagement, just as a point of principle, does it not feel strange or unusual sending a draft policy to one individual when there are many ways, surely, in accordance to best practice, that you can tap into a much wider lived experience?
There were a number of reasons why the policy was shared at that point, and I would say it was shared very carefully and with an understanding, having taken advice, that a person in this situation may not be objective, so this wasn't about accepting drafting changes that would shape the application of this policy should they decide to move to a formal complaint. So it was really after consideration that if they were going to proceed, they should understand the policy that was likely to be applied in that case, so they could make an informed decision. And it was also set out as part of a range of options to the individual, one of which was always not to make a formal complaint. So that option was always there. I think the tenor of the conversation and part of what we were looking at that point was we needed to learn lessons really quickly, as many organisations were trying to learn lessons very quickly. And a big part of the discussion there was about, would this have made a difference to you? What elements of these kinds of policies would make a difference? So it was very much not would this make a difference to you raising a complaint now, but would this be preventative in the future? Would this help us prevent these kinds of things happening in future?
Okay, but you weren't making it up as you went along, were you?
In what sense?
Well, there's been much emphasis by your own commentary, Ms Richards, and what we've heard from Mr Hind, saying in particular developing a retrospective process that included former ministers, while that, in his view, in the view of others, that was the right thing to do. It was not straightforward. You were working from a blank sheet, lots of references to this being different work or unique work, but you know, nonetheless, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. There is a wealth of experience elsewhere, surely Acas and such like.
And I think whilst it's important to understand that the committee wish to understand the development of the procedure, I think it's very important to recognise that someone can raise a complaint at any point, whether you have a process or not. And if you don't have a process, you would then need to work out what you were going to do about that complaint. So whilst it's helpful and important to try and be transparent and write your policies out, it doesn't actually stop somebody raising a complaint about something. And complaints about third parties, which is essentially, what a minister or a former minister would be in this instance, is a fairly routine part of other policies. It's included within our fairness at work policy. People will have issues with contractors, with people that they come across in other organisations. And what you always have to be clear to people, I think, in those instances, is that there are limits to what you can do. There are limits to the degree to which you can compel someone else to participate in that process, because they're not your employee, so you can't enforce their engagement in the development, in the investigation, and there are limitations to the sanctions that you can apply. So there is a fairly well worked out territory here, but yes, it is certainly more complex than it being a civil servant to civil servant policy.
And my very final question, Convener, is yes, complaints need to be investigated, and if there's no process, there needs to be a process and procedure put in place. But therefore, how do you ensure that it's fair and robust to all parties, particularly when it's done at pace? And, you know, what have you learned in terms of the here and now?
I think we're very clear that the procedure is fair and it still stands and it is legal. The work was done very, very carefully to make sure that it fitted in all of those instances. I think you would certainly learn lessons from the whole process in terms of being very clear in terms of the roles that people play and what you're doing at particular points in time. But in terms of having a robust process, I think we can stand by that.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Can I ask quickly, Ms Richards, was anyone else with lived experience asked to comment on the draft policy?
I should be clear, people weren't really asked to comment. They were shared with it for information, but they weren't asked to kind of give drafting comments, if you like. It was more
So
sharing
other
up
people
things.
with lived experience were shown copies of the draft policy?
Yes, I think one other person was shown a copy.
Okay. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
You know, I have two sections of questions. Firstly, about the development of the policy and then the application of the policy. I'm happy to break between those and allow others to come in. Good morning, Ms Richards. James Hind confirmed to the committee that there was a background hum of water cooler conversations and rumours about alleged bullying and sexual harassment, misconduct on the part of the former First Minister, Alex Salmond. You joined the organisation in 2010, 4 years before Alex Salmond left office. Can I ask at what point you first heard that informal chatter about concerns about the former First Minister's behaviour?
I'm here to give evidence on behalf of Scottish ministers and not in a personal capacity, so I don't think it's right for me to kind of repeat.
The Ministerial Code, if I may, the Ministerial Code, the Civil Service Code allows us to ask you about your recollection of facts and events. We've had Mr Hind confirm that there was a background chatter about concerns about the behaviour of the former First Minister. That's a fact. I'm just asking you when you first learned of that.
In my role in HR at that time, between 2010 and 2014, my role was more on the learning and development side, so bullying and harassment was not in my remit.
I'm asking about the water cooler conversations that were probably happening in various corners of the building.
I mean, I think in some senses you are slightly aside of that than you are if you're in more kind of ministerially facing roles. I would certainly say at any point in any organisation there's likely to be chatter and noise.
So when did you first hear that chatter about Alex Salmond?
I couldn't give you a specific answer to that.
Was it really recently, or like when all this blew up, or was it near the start of your term in office in the government?
I'm not sure if I can answer it. We can maybe answer it and then confirm whether the legal advisors are content.
But you did know about it.
To say that.
Okay, that's fine.
Richards, if you don't wish to go any further, that's fine.
That's fine. So further to Angela Constance's question about you handing a copy of the draft to one of the people who would later become a complainer, when did you first learn of the allegations of harassment made by that complainer? There was clearly an informal process about this before a formal complaint was lodged. When did she first reveal to you that she had these allegations to make?
I'd need to check the detail. I think that she didn't reveal them to me, and she didn't ever give her account to me directly in that way. She came forward we had put in place a confidential sounding board, and she came forward to that director to share her experience, and that individual then shared a written account with us as HR as part of that process. So, and I think that was the 22nd of November, I think, but I would probably want to just confirm the date. But
there is an email I will refer to in the second half of my questions, which sounds at odds with that suggestion that it was never raised with you directly prior to it becoming made formal. Can I, before we get to that, and I will allow other members in before that, was that draft procedure shared with that particular complainer to give them confidence in the process that would ultimately assess the credibility of that complaint?
it was to ensure they were able to make an informed decision. So you would want them to go into something understanding some of the process that they would be moving into. But as I say, it would have, if they'd have raised the complaint at that point before the process was in place, then we still would have had to have dealt with it.
And was that draft shared with them so that they could help design the procedure to best fit their complaint?
No, not in any direction at all.
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to understand if the findings of the 2016 People Survey helped identify the gap that policy should be applied to former ministers. Was that something that came up as a result of people's responses to the survey, or was it entirely separate to that process?
No, I wouldn't say it would have come up through that process. It would be entirely separate to that.
Okay, thank you. Following on from colleagues' questions on the nature of the informal rules given to individuals around sexual harassment complaints, I'd just like to understand what was going on in that regard. For example, we've heard that potentially female workers were advised to avoid loan working at certain times and in certain situations. Would that be an example of an informal means of dealing with a harassment complaint?
Are you asking in the sort of broader sense or about that specific?
I'm asking in a broader sense. I'd like to understand what informal mechanisms there were to assist those who had raised informal concerns.
I mean, generally when people raise informal concerns, they do so in the line, so they wouldn't necessarily come to HR. But certainly there are a range of things that you might do and recommend managers to do if issues are raised with them. As ever, it will depend on the seriousness of the matter, and that will have a big bearing as to whether any kind of informal resolution is appropriate, but you would always be guided by the individual raising the issue. The kinds of things that people would do in those circumstances would be forms of mediation, facilitated conversations, might be training. It'd be those kinds of things that people would put in place most generally. And sometimes people would apply to, kind of lone worker type policies, and certainly in relation to our fairness at work policy, in relation to engagement with third parties. So if you've got regular contact with an organisation that you're finding problematic in some way, then there's provision for you to not meet them alone and to do those kinds of things. So there's a range of measures that people might put in place in order to ensure that people feel comfortable with their working environment.
And there's been much discussion of the sharing of a policy with a particular individual. For absolute clarity, at the point the draft procedure was being shared with that individual, was that individual a complainer?
No.
Okay, thank you. You've spoken of, you've highlighted the fact that few workplace policies have to withstand the scrutiny that this policy has been put through. But we've had much reference to legal advice being taken on the development of the policy throughout the evidence sessions we've taken so far. But it seems that even that level of legal intervention wasn't sufficient to ensure, for example, that the policy was applied robustly enough to avoid the outcome of the judicial review. I note that with regard to the policy, it says the Director of People will designate a senior civil servant as the investigating officer to deal with the complaint. I'd just like to understand why this policy wasn't applied robustly in this case.
Our sense at the time, and certainly my sense at the time, was that it was applied robustly. We thought carefully about the designation of a senior civil servant into the role of the investigating officer, and the kinds of qualities that we had thought about in advance in the more abstract sense of having legal or professional background, HR background. These were the kinds of skills and experience that we were looking to make sure that somebody would be able to apply. The person that I asked to take on the role had many years professional experience, including in very complex and tricky situations. They'd been the head of HR in a mental health charity for 10 years, so they were bringing a wealth of experience that is not common across the wider civil service. So I think our sense was that They were not even in the organisation at the point when the events were alleged to have occurred, so they had no engagement in any way with those events. And as the Cabinet Office wider guidance says, in complex and historical cases, it might be appropriate for cases to be handled within HR. So from my perspective, we were applying the process robustly and clearly in line with the advice and the intention that had been set out.
So in your view, you would do the same thing again?
I think I would be very cautious in terms of clarity of the roles that people were playing at particular points. And it's very clear in retrospect through the judicial review process that the paragraph 10 could be interpreted in a different way, and therefore that even the contact that somebody had in their role as an HR professional could be misconstrued. So I think you would be cautious about that, but certainly at the time that was not a concern that we had.
Okay, thank you. Just finally, there were obviously, is it the case that there were complaints being received at the same time as the policy was being drafted?
We had, in response to the Permanent Secretary's messages, that staff messages that were coming through at that time, I think in that kind of October to December period, we had about 10 people come forward to raise issues. Most of those were about civil servants, so they were issues around harassment, sexual harassment. Some of those were formalised during that time. They would have been dealt with under the Fairness at Work policy and were followed through. Some were dealt with at an informal resolution, and some of them the individuals decided not to proceed. There weren't any formal complaints received under this procedure before January.
It's obviously really important that there's an appropriate distance between those who are drafting a policy and those who are responsible for implementing that policy. And is it your view that lines were blurred between the two work streams, where we have a policy being drafted, being shared with someone who then goes on to become a complainant? Do you not see that as a blurring of lines that should be avoided?
In terms of drafting a process and applying it, I mean, that would happen very frequently in HR departments, that it will be your HR policy team that will be developing a policy, putting that in place, and then they will be applying it. So I'm not sure that that would be an unusual arrangement.
It just seems, I mean, obviously there are many employees within the civil service, but the draft policy has only been shared specifically with 2 individuals.
Well, it's on our intranet, so it is available more widely.
Okay. I've no further questions at this point.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Can I just follow up that point? I mean, you did only share the draft with 2 people. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, well, in terms of we engage with the unions on it, we're engaging with legal.
Absolutely, but that was after the event. As it was being developed, you shared it with 2 people.
Yes, because
Okay, that's. I just wanted to establish that, because the point about the intranet came much, much later. It came in February, after which time you'd received 2 complaints. Can I say, from an HR perspective, you're making a distinction between concerns and complaints. Is that not a bit of a false distinction, given the seriousness of the allegations?
I mean, it's a distinction in kind of policy terms in that.
But it's not a distinction in the real world, is it?
I mean, I think you're right in that should individuals have decided not to pursue a formal complaint, I think organisationally we still would have had some very significant things to think through. If somebody had said, I don't want to proceed with making a formal complaint, and yet we had a reasonably detailed set of allegations from somebody, then I think organisationally we would have had to have found a way of establishing some closure on that.
So you shared a draft policy on the 14th of December with people who had expressed concerns, not complaints, though I don't recognise the distinction, before the policy was approved. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
I mean, I think I set that out in the earlier answer, but I'm happy to go through that again.
Just briefly would be useful.
The reasons why we shared that were that we were trying to establish, in terms of our learning as an organisation, whether this would have made a difference to them at the time. Would it have made it more possible to have raised issues about a First Minister, an incumbent First Minister? Would that have made it more straightforward for them if a policy of this nature had been in place? It was done so that if they did decide to proceed to a formal complaint, they had an awareness of the policy that would like to be applied.
But you didn't consult women's groups or anti-bullying groups or anything like that? I think you responded.
We spoke to the Scottish Parliament very closely. We spoke to Police Scotland. They provided a range of advice around charities relating to sexual violence.
Okay, so you didn't actually speak to those groups themselves. Right, can I move us on? Did you tell any potential complainants that Judith McKinnon would be appointed as the investigating officer under a policy which hadn't yet been approved?
I think I told one of the complainers that if they did decide to move to a formal complaint, that it was likely that Judith would take the role of the senior officer.
On what date did you do that?
I don't know. I would need to check the specific date.
Could you? And I'm very conscious that in the civil service everything gets written down, yet I can't seem to find the piece of paper that tells me this. I wonder whether you'd provide the committee with that information too, when you're checking on what date.
Yes, of course. I thought that had been submitted.
Nope. Well, I can't find it.
Okay.
Okay. Can I move on to ask you that the Permanent Secretary last week seemed to suggest that she wasn't deeply involved in developing the policy process. Did you, as Director of People, not keep her updated? You know, what contact did you have with her, or indeed her private secretary? How often was that?
My contact with the Permanent Secretary is generally quite frequent. At this stage, there was a range of different work going on. There was a lot of staff communications underway. So my role really was to keep her abreast of the full range of activities. She was very concerned that we could be, as she would say, show a clean pair of heels as an organisation in terms of our position on harassment and sexual harassment, that we were really setting out an exemplar position. So across all of those areas, whether it was our internal policies, whether it was communications with staff, whether it was the wider kind of cultural shift, as well as the ministerial policy. So yeah, I would have been in contact with her or her office probably at least on a weekly basis.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question. Mr. Hind earlier, I don't know if you heard his evidence, he was very clear that the policy itself was lawful, but the implementation was not lawful. Given that implementation is an HR function, do you think that's an accurate reflection, or has he indeed just thrown you under the bus?
I think he would have been speaking accurately in relation to the judicial review. We conceded the judicial review on the basis of one aspect of the application. And so in that one aspect of the application, it was deemed to be unlawful by the standard applied by a judicial review.
Thank you, Convener.
Have a short, very particular supplementary from Alistair Allen, and then on to Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, just picking up on the point made a moment ago by Ms Bailey about the distinction between a concern and a complaint. Would I be right in understanding from what you've just said that the distinction doesn't really have anything to do with the seriousness of the issue? It's more to do with the attitude of the person. Presumably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but presumably not everybody who wishes to make known their concerns about something wishes to pursue a formal complaint. Thank you.
Maureen Watt.
Convener, good afternoon, Ms Richards. You said you joined the civil service in late 2010 in learning and development. What qualifications did you come with?
My background was running a leadership development charity, so I spent 5 years with a leadership development charity. So I came into the learning and development side of the work within People Directorate with that background in leadership, learning and organisational development.
Qualifications in HR?
Not specifically as CIPD, no.
Are you a member of the CIPD?
No, I'm not.
You said, it was been said that there was external advice taken. Did any of that come with a cost, and if so, how much?
During the setup of the procedure?
Yeah.
I don't recall. I don't think so. I mean, certainly not in terms of costs. I mean, most of it was in the sense of lessons learned many organisations were in a similar position, needing to look at their own policies, needing to make sure that they were engaging effectively with staff. So I don't think the Scottish Parliament's HR department sent us a bill, so I think they, you know, there was lots of exchange. We've got a wider HR forum of professionals across all of the agencies and NDPBs. We would get together and share material in that way. So, yeah, I don't recall that, but I don't know if on the legal side there may have been some costs.
Strikes me if anybody had been a member of the professional organisation in relation to HR, it might have been quite helpful in this process. However, we'll move on. It's said in our background information that 10% of Scottish Government staff had faced bullying or harassment. That's 10% of how many, roughly? The current survey, I think, covers about 6,500 people. Just as a point of information, I would want to indicate, however, on your previous point, that a number of HR qualified and employment law qualified people were involved in the development of the process. Okay, well, following up on that, the investigating officer, although you said she had some background in dealing with this, that she wasn't an HR professional in the true sense of, well, you know, to me an HR professional is somebody who's gained a qualification in it, a recognised qualification in it.
Sorry, no, I'm not CIPD qualified, but Judith McKinnon is a fellow of the CIPD.
Okay, that's good
Sorry,
to know. Thank you. It just seems to me that in much of this that we're investigating, the HR department or directorate has kind of been downgraded in a lot of the things, and it could have had a more proactive role. So 10% of 6,500. It's also said that the respondents were able to select multiple categories in relation to the bullying or harassment they encountered. And then it goes on to say the majority of incidents of bullying or harassment came from colleagues, 117, direct managers, 117, or managers in the same part of the organisation, 123. Is the multiple categories those three, or were there further ones that could further drill down into whether they were from heads of service or ministers?
The full list of, when asked who bullied or harassed you, the full list within the UK Civil Service survey covers colleagues in your area, colleagues in a different area, your manager, another senior member of staff, someone I manage, someone working in a different civil service organisation, someone working for a non-civil service organisation, a contractor, a service user, a member of the public, or someone not listed here.
So what category would ministers fall into?
I think someone would probably say another senior member of staff in the Scottish Government, but as I say, these aren't categories that we get to decide on, and in those kinds of settings that would be a relatively small number, so I'm not sure that in any of the UK civil service policies they would set out ministers in such an explicit way.
Was that ever discussed among HR professionals around the country, and whether there should be a specific category for ministers if we're going to be open and transparent?
I'm happy to suggest it. I haven't ever been in one of those conversations.
You haven't been in a conversation about the development of the survey?
In more general terms, but not specifically about adding ministers to that list.
That seems a bit odd. Okay, I'll leave it at that just now.
Okay. Can I just ask Ms Richards, we talked earlier with Mr Hines about the UK Parliament review on such things. Do you know if that was a particular aspect of the discussion about whether ministers should be quite clearly defined in the interests of transparency?
Sorry, you said in the UK Parliament review?
Sorry, there was a review done by the UK government,
UK government,
which was under discussion at the time the Scottish Government was putting their policy together. Do you know if the aspect of definition of ministers in the interest of transparency was part of that review?
I believe it had a section in the material that they put together, but I may be confusing the Sue Owens review with their kind of more detailed guidance. They have a section about if there are complaints against ministers or special advisors, so they have a section related to that within that material.
Yeah. Yes, I'd be interested to know, following on from the questions that Maureen Watt asked, whether the need for further clarity in that regard would be required, because it does make the figures quite difficult to interpret.
I mean, I would say again, it's important to recognise that the survey is not a mechanism for people to raise individual issues. It's a mechanism by which you get an overall sense of the culture of an organisation. So it is quite wide-ranging in that way. And I would say on the bullying and harassment scores in particular, across the kind of 100+ organisations that are covered, bullying and harassment scores vary from 5% to 20%. I think this year we were 11%, and of the big organisations of which we compare to, the average is 12%. So whilst it sounds a very disturbing figure, and I think it is a disturbing figure because we wouldn't want anybody to be experiencing bullying and harassment as part of their ongoing work, it is a fairly consistent picture, I think, across most organisations. That
Memory, are bullying and harassment the one heading?
They are, yeah.
They are.
And it's quite wide-ranging. Though, as I say, in 2019 there was a breakdown so that you could get more specific in terms of the nature of the harassment. The biggest category in 2019, I think, is around micromanagement, that being the kind of key issue on which people most regularly said they felt that they had experienced bullying and harassment.
And when the figures are put together, if someone has ticked more than one of the boxes in relation to what they've been suffering, how does that get reflected in the figures in terms of it being the same person who's perhaps ticked 4 boxes?
I'd need to check the exact way in which people are able to do, whether they can. So, no, it does say multiple selections, so yes, they would be able to select more than one category.
Yeah, but how would that then be counted? Would it be 4 instances, or would it just be 1 instance?
I would assume it's counted as 4 instances.
Right, so the figures may not reflect the number of people.
Yeah, though you do also get the numbers of people, so you can probably do a comparison.
Okay,
across the two.
thank you for that clarification. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. We heard from Mr Hind about the iterative process that was involved in producing the policy. Can you say a bit more about your role in determining the content of the various stages of that iterative process?
As James set out, he leaded off on the drafting. There was lots of engagement across legal and members of my team in terms of setting out, I think in particular, how do you bring together the ministerial code responsibilities with those of the employer, and particularly the duty of care to staff. So that was really, I suppose, the key part that I was playing in that, was making sure that we were linking across to the duty of care to staff, our responsibilities as an employer within the policy.
And on that duty of care, I'm going to be careful how I ask this, because I'm not asking about individuals here, but you said that you sort out, we've heard that rather, people with, in inverted commas, lived experience were sought out or were contacted in any case. I take it some kind of support was offered to these individuals as well.
I mean, the individuals had already come forward to the confidential sounding board, so, support had already been offered through that kind of route. So the sharing of the procedure was really just part of a wider discussion with them in terms of the options open to them and their wishes.
And can you tell us from your own point of view, but from your own role, where you came in to decisions that were made about including former ministers in the policy?
Or this was already included.
Okay. And would you concur with what we've heard from Mr Hind, which is that about the fairly limited role of SPADs. But again, were you in touch with SPADs throughout this process? No?
No engagement at all.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, I have Murdo Fraser, and then I'll go back to Alex Cole-Hamilton, who kindly kept reserved some of his questions. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I only have really one question as a follow-up to Alistair Allen's question about the involvement of special advisors. And we heard from Mr Hind earlier that, in his view, it would be unusual to have a special advisor involved in the preparation of a policy based on HR. Would that be, from your experience, that would be a reasonable position?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was distracted. How dare I, please, Mr Fraser? You're done?
I'm done.
That's so unlike you. My goodness. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Richards, before I get on to my questions about the application of this procedure, can I just say, I know this is very stressful for you. I accept that, and I appreciate you coming today. And this must jar against everything you've always been taught about protecting both the civil service and the government. But it's really important that we get to the nub of the truth in all of this. And the Civil Service Code does not preclude you from doing it. And I have to say, from some of the answers that you've given and some of the answers that James Hind has given, that we as a committee do seem to be encountering what I would describe as a grey wall of silence on some of this. So I'd ask just in these final questions if you could be as straight as possible. Because when Alison Johnson asked whether complainers had come forward during the development of the process, you said they had not. But obviously they were not complainers at the time because there was no procedure for them to complain by. But we know that there were 3 of them from an email you wrote on the 12th of December. And for the record, that's document YY0046. In that, you wrote an email to Miss A asking if, after your discussion with her, that she'd come to a decision on whether to raise a formal complaint. In the email, you keep using the term we, by which you mean yourself and Judith McKinnon, who was copied into the same email. You suggest Miss A wait until after the new year if she wanted to proceed. Did you suggest this so that you could be sure that the new policy on handling complaints against former ministers had been signed off and was then live?
I think I was going on holiday the next day.
Okay.
Okay. I think even civil servants were allowed holidays. I would just like to clarify a couple of points. I said that it was shared that they weren't a complainer at that point. They had raised a concern, but they hadn't formally raised a complaint. She could at any point have decided to say this is the formal complaint. We may or may not have had the procedure in place at that time, but we still would have had to have dealt with it. So it's an issue, but it's not really the deciding issue.
Thank you. In the same email, you say we, and by that you mean you and Miss McKinnon, have now spoken to 2 other people considering their position. Can I ask first, had either of those other 2 complainers or potential complainers been given a draft of the procedure?
I don't recall specifically, but my recollection is that we had a hard copy with us when we spoke to one of the others. They did not come forward with a complaint.
Okay. You chose at this point in the email to reveal the existence of other complainers to Miss A. Was it your intention to share this knowledge with Miss A so that she might go and seek out those other potential complainants?
No, it wasn't. We'd taken advice from Police Scotland in terms of how to take a victim-led approach, and part of that indicated that you could say that if there were other people who were considering complaints, it might be of help to them. I would say, actually, I probably can't say because I think it will get us into territory in terms of the complainers. But yeah, I probably sorry, I can't.
And
Can I stop you there, because these documents have not been published by the Parliament?
so well, in which case, Convener, I'm not entirely sure on what basis we're meant to use these documents if we're not allowed to use them to cross-examine witnesses.
Well, they're for your own information, and I would draw your attention to the court restrictions that are there and to the issue of potential jigsaw identification. And the committee did take the decision that we wouldn't directly refer to anything that hadn't been published by the Parliament. So if you want to carry on, please do so in very general terms, but please don't be specific, because I understand Ms Richards' concerns.
Okay, no, I accept that we agreed that we wouldn't discuss things that have not been published. I accept that, but nevertheless, I think that this is a very, very important point and a very important exchange. So forgive me if I've overstepped the mark. I won't refer to the email again, but my final question or questions is specifically about paragraph 10 of the procedure. It lays out that a designated senior civil servant will be designated as investigating officer, and that person won't have any prior involvement or knowledge of the matter being raised. Given that Judith McKinnon had already had discussions with complainers, did you at any point consider her appointment in that role as problematic, given the gravity of these allegations under the terms of paragraph 10?
I didn't, and I think it certainly was the gravity of these issues and the sensitivity of them which made it so important that we were able to handle it very confidentially within HR, and to do so very, very carefully with people who were very highly skilled. The engagement that Judith had with the individuals in advance was absolutely in her role as an HR professional. It was about setting out options. In earlier drafts of the procedure, we actually had more detail about what that senior officer role might include, and that included setting out their options. It included providing access to sources of support. So in my mind, it was completely consistent with that.
Did you consult any other senior civil servant or senior member of the SNP or special advisor on the appointment of Judith McKinnon as the investigating officer for these complaints?
I spoke to my line manager and, kind of the other people engaged at that time, but no one on the political side at all.
Thank you. No further questions.
Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder, Ms Richards, if I could direct you to document YY062, the emails on the 10th of November 2017. And these appeared to appoint 2 senior officials to the informal role of pastoral support and confident. And there was also an email to staff to offer senior government official contact informally to talk over any issues. Was this put in place as a result of the gap analysis which HR carried out, establishing that there was a reluctance for people to come forward? And if so, how many people roughly did come forward? And of those people, did any of them end up to be formal complainers at the end of the day? And there's one other aspect. I know I've asked 3 questions, but hopefully this one you will also answer. If this was good practice and a good way of giving these people the support to come forward, why wasn't it included in the formal development of policy? Because without that, it looks as though this was set up for a niche reason, which was nothing to do with putting in the very best policy to encourage these individuals who've been treated so badly to come forward.
I think on the pastoral support, the confidential sounding board, as it became known, I think there were a lot of organisations at that point were trying to understand what creates the reluctance in people coming forward, particularly around sexual harassment, but more generally. And I think that the Scottish Parliament was putting in place a helpline. It was doing an independent helpline in that way. So I think a lot of organisations at that time were thinking about how do you bridge the gap. And certainly for us, putting in a senior person who could be contacted in that kind of way, it felt like it was an opportunity, I think, to really just to be sure that we didn't have a big issue that we weren't aware of, that there wasn't something lurking that we didn't fully understand. And I think it's a valuable process. We do already have within Scottish Government, and have had for some time, an employee assistance programme, and that's a 24/7 line, so people can phone that to seek advice and support on any issue. But that is completely separate. So if they raise things in that setting, it wouldn't be a mechanism, there wouldn't be a route back to the organisation knowing about it unless the individual decided to take that step. So the confidential sounding board, I suppose, is in a slightly kind of greyer area in that they're not entirely independent and outside, and in that case unconnected back into the core organisation.
Is that the reason? Is that the case?
No, I mean, I think there's opportunities for us to continue there. I think it very quickly...
But at present, if someone came forward, they do not have that opportunity to speak to this informal pair, to have that person, to be encouraged, you know, to have the confidence to go forward. That doesn't exist.
I would need to
present.
check, but I think it may well still be on our intranet. So
Permanent Secretary suggested it was a one-off just for on the back of the Me Too. And that seems incredible. It then begins to look like a niche arrangement for a specific purpose.
I mean, certainly at was described as the watershed moment. I think certainly there were provisions put in place at that time. I think the individual had, I don't know if they all came directly to her, some of them came to HR, but there were about 10 people that came forward during that time. Some of those did proceed to formal complaints, some of them were resolved through other means. But I think that it came to a point where actually no one was contacting her anymore, so it didn't, you know, it sort of fell away more naturally, I think, in that people weren't coming forward directly in that way. But I think, you know, yes, I mean, certainly we would
I think it's a moving feast with people. It's not a moment of time people aren't coming forward, so I don't find that answer very persuasive.
Well, no, and I think we'd be very keen and happy to continue to have that kind of arrangement in place.
Thank you.
I don't see indications from any other members. So can I ask a final question? I'm still really interested in this issue about a draft policy being shared with potential complainers. And I'm interested to know why it wasn't shared with any other members of staff who perhaps had raised concerns about bullying, harassment, who had been through the process before, just to see whether they felt that this was an improvement on the situation that they went through, perhaps, or you know, if they felt that actually this wouldn't have been much better. So their experiences could have fed into the development of policy. And I'm interested as to why that sharing of policy wasn't widened in any way.
I think for a specific policy about complaints about ministers, we had very, very few, in fact, no formal complaints about ministers until these had been raised. So all we had at that point was one issue that had been raised and dealt with under the informal policy, but that wouldn't have been covered by this policy anyway because it wasn't a sexual harassment incident. So it wasn't, you know, we didn't have a wide staff group with relevant experience on whom we could draw.
So it was really just about ministers?
Well, the policy is just about ministers.
Yes, so you weren't interested in gathering wider information about the organisation in general as part of all of this?
Oh, well, that was all underway at the same time, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of work going on about our internal policies. There was a lot of work going on about civil servant to civil servant behaviours. We refreshed our standards of behaviour. We created a new route map so that individuals in the organisation could understand all of the routes by which harassment and considerations could be raised. So yeah, there was a wide range of work going on with the wider staff group, but that was more general and it wasn't specific to ministers.
So you had a staff group particularly that you would consult with on wider issues of such policy?
We tend to do all of that directly with our trade unions because they have that role as representing staff. So we would do that more specifically with the trade unions, but also more generally we have things like a people panel. So you'll have issues where you might test topics with the people panel and through the wider people survey. So, and also our staff network, so our equality groups. Typically we would include them in the development of new policies as well. But I think it was a specific policy that the First Minister needed to sign off, and in that instance slightly different to normal HR policies where we would go through that range of activity.
So you very much dealt with it in isolation then?
I mean, we were seeing it as part of an overall, package of work that was underway, but it was specific in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think that there's anything else, and again, oh, yes, Alec Cole-Hamilton, yes.
Following your questioning there, just one point of clarification, and it's the second person who was shared draft of the procedure, did they then go on to form a formal complaint, or were they a potential complainer who then decided not to take it forward?
They didn't proceed to a formal complaint.
That's fine.
Okay. Can I thank Ms Richards, and no doubt looking through the official report there are some issues which we will expect a submission in writing upon. Thank you very, very much for your attendance. And that concludes the public evidence sessions for today, and we'll now move into private session.